2023. Well, with the Pan Am Games in full swing, the issue of traffic congestion is, of course, once again in the spotlight. A report from the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario, out today, argues in favor of hiking gas taxes and instituting road tolls, and then using that money to pay for new roads and public transit. How big a hike? How about increasing the tax from 14.7 cents a litre to 23 cents? Joining me now with the details is the author of that report. Harry Kitchen is a professor emeritus at Trent University. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So can you lay out the case for us here, the gist of the report? Why is this tax hike important?
Okay. Well, there are a number of reasons. I think I've written reports over the last on financing roads and transit for a number of years now, and indeed a number of other people have as well. And all of these reports have essentially recommended that we should use increased fuel taxes to fund public transit and roads. So the argument of whether we should use fuel taxes or not has been around for a long time, and it's generally accepted that it is probably a proper vehicle to use, a proper instrument to use. Why the increase by 8 cents over its current rate? Well, what I did, there have been reports done and a number of consultant studies and studies by other organizations that have said, if we raised it 5 cents a litre, 10 cents a litre, this is the amount of revenue we got. But there was no rationale as to why it should be 5 or 10. So what I did, I went back and I took a look at the date that the tax was set at its current rate, which was 1992. And it was set in 1992, the motor fuel tax was set at 14.7 cents per litre, and the diesel fuel at 14.3. And this is the provincial tax, not the federal. And essentially, if we had increased that by the annual rate of inflation, we would now be paying 23 cents per litre on motor fuel and 22 cents on diesel fuel. And so my argument is that we need that up to 23 to give us the same purchasing power as we had in the year in which the tax was implemented.
Some people would remind you that since then we have that gas tax may not have been increased, but we have had the HST added.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's absolutely right. The HST has been on that, and that also adds it, but it doesn't go to the HST is a tax that just goes into general funds, as does the current provincial fuel tax. What I'm arguing is that we should increase the gas tax, set aside the revenues collected on the provincial bill, put it into a dedicated fund. Don't put it into general revenues. Put it into a dedicated fund and use it specifically for improving the transit and transportation system in the province.
And you also say that this plan and this fund, resulting from that increased tax and the road tolls, would help pay down Ontario's deficit. How would that work?
Well, what it would do, I would use this money specifically for roads and transit, which means it would free up current revenues or general revenues to pay down the deficit. Okay. My argument is here. Look, the province is facing, I think, a problem. I would be very surprised if they can meet their balanced budget commitment of 2017 and 18 without raising taxes. The question that comes, which tax or which taxes? And it seems to me the easiest tax to use is one that's already there, and a tax where you can say, look, if you use a service, you are going to pay for the service, as opposed to just charging everybody an increased HST or an increased income tax, and then using it to benefit a few people who happen to use roads.
Well, and in a year when climate change has been a huge issue, I guess you've got some environmental benefits here, too, in terms of disincentives for people driving.
Well, that's right, and I address that. And indeed, I think this increase in the fuel tax could be treated like a carbon tax, but it wouldn't be a full-blown carbon tax because it wouldn't be on everything that creates greenhouse emissions. It would only be on fuel, automobiles and vehicles that use motor fuel and diesel fuel. And it would be it's not very far removed from the carbon tax, which has been in place now for some time in British Columbia. And if you look at the carbon tax in Vancouver now, it currently is about, I believe, at 6.67 cents on motor fuel and 7.67 cents on diesel fuel. So it's not very different than what I'm recommending here.
You've got you talk about getting people, sort of a user pay situation, but a lot of people in the inner suburbs are using their cars to get to work every day because the transit is so poor. And this would be a substantial raise in their taxes. Is it fair to saddle them, people who aren't high income earners with this tax?
It's interesting. You either tax people on the basis of ability to pay, or you tax them on a tax that's based on if you use a service, you pay for a service. And so that's why we have a mix of taxes. And I think whenever you can put a tax on the user of a service, that's the kind of tax that should be applied. Now, we have income distribution programs, income transfer programs in the province. And if the person's really poor, absolutely, they need help through an income assistance program. But the concern I have, if you start saying we have to have lower prices to protect those guys, you're also having lower prices to protect rich people who may use the service more than the people you think you have to protect.
I wonder how likely do you think government is to adopt these fairly unpopular with a lot of voters, these kinds of recommendations?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, the province has got to do something, and they know that. I mean, we can't go on like we are. We just want to downgrade in the credit rating. They don't want to increase the debt anymore. They got to get rid of the deficit. I mean, they've got to do something. And the provincial government of BC brought in a carbon tax, and they brought it in a number of years ago, and it's now in place. And there are naysayers, but the people who do the serious analytical work have done studies on the carbon tax in BC, and it's turned out to be quite successful. All
right. Thank you for your thoughts and explanation today.
Okay, thank you.
That's Harry Kitchen, a professor emeritus at Trent University, explaining a new report of which he is the author from the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario, argues in favor of raising gas taxes and instituting tolls on roads to fund infrastructure and transit. We always welcome your thoughts at CBC Here and Now. Right now, speaking of transit, here's Jennifer Young.
Well,